In Acts 26:8, the Apostle Paul remarked to King Agrippa, "Why should it be thought a thing incredible with you that God should raise the dead?" The apostles were eyewitnesses of the most significant event in history. Jesus resurrected from the dead. Bible believers, even before Jesus, understood that a general resurrection was promised. Job says, "Though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God." That's found in Job 19:26. Jesus himself said in John 5:28, "All that are in the graves shall hear his voice and shall come forth." The central message of the gospel after the crucifixion was that Jesus had risen again and was seen alive by hundreds of witnesses. But when hearing about resurrection, a specifically biblical notion of afterlife, some folks are understandably skeptical. Skepticism isn't bad, it's necessary. All the apostles were skeptical at first. Apparently Agrippa also thought that resurrection was incredible or unworthy of serious consideration. The implication is that any talk of the supernatural, such as belief in an afterlife, is nothing but superstition or religious wishful thinking. Modern intellectuals not only refuse to seriously ponder such topics, they aggressively ridicule believers as inferior thinkers. They often describe themselves as rationalists or free thinkers, or lately they've taken to calling themselves the Brights. Obviously, they are convinced that what sets them apart from believers is their superior ability to reason, which begs the question, calling yourself bright compared to such dull forebears as Copernicus, Bacon, Kepler, Bach, Newton, Pascal, Faraday, the list could go on, all of which were believers, well, that is clearly overreach. And that is probably why they resort to ridicule. Call it an intellectual Napoleon complex. But even in ridicule, Paul doesn't waver, nor did any of the other apostles. There is no second guessing among them, and no apology. I guess once you've seen something yourself, you aren't affected much by intellectual scoffing. Of course, faith in God is not irrational. Denial of God borders on absurdity. God's existence is superficially intuitive and profoundly logical. But that argument only deals with simple belief in God. Paul is asking why the resurrection should be considered incredible. Paul is implying that belief in the resurrection of the dead is as reasonable as belief in God. Anyone who begrudges theists the relatively modest label of rational must hack up a lung at the thought of granting that respect to moonbeams like Paul talking about resurrection. Even believers who know faith in God is a rational conclusion may wonder how the resurrection also is. The apostles saw the resurrection of Christ personally, and no amount of intellectual argument or ridicule could overpower that experience. But Paul is bewildered that these intellectuals are skeptical about the possibility of resurrection. In 1 Corinthians 15:38, Paul even replies to some who ask, "How are the dead raised?" By calling them fools. "Thou fool," he says, "that which thou sowest is not quickened except it die." In other words, if you have ever wondered how God will raise up a body that has been burned or decomposed or dismembered, Paul says you are a fool for asking. Now that we understand the mechanics of DNA, we can see that the question is rather misguided. Our bodies are built according to a digital code, and the actual molecules that make up our bodies are replaceable. Our bodies are not the carbon and water they are made of, but rather a sequence of complex instructions that can be copied, stored, disassembled, and reassembled. So the question of how turns out to be just as silly as Paul declared. But Paul didn't know about DNA. He was reasoning from another angle. The truth is, once the first step of faith is taken, that God exists and that He created us, belief in an afterlife follows naturally. Consider 3 reasons, the same reasons an infidel like Thomas Paine used when defending his belief in an afterlife. 3 reasons that do not require you to see a resurrected person yourself. The first reason is the one Paul was explaining to the Corinthians, the clues God placed in nature. Paul used a seed to illustrate one of the most amazing and most prolific facts of biological nature, the multi-phase life of living things. A seed is a living organism. It's not a piece of a parent plant like a leaf or a flower. A seed is a new organism, and it does not seem incredible to us that a seed has a greater potential and destiny than appears on its surface. It seems rational to us because we have seen it proven thousands of times. It is planted in the ground, and then God gives it a new body, much more developed than its seed form. Insects go through metamorphosis between their larva stage and their adult stage. A caterpillar is a whole animal in its own right, but a caterpillar is not a worm. It will one day bury itself or wrap itself in a cocoon and undergo a spectacular transformation and eventually emerge as a butterfly or other flying insect. Frogs undergo an equally remarkable transformation from aquatic to land animals. Is this incredible? No, it is a teaching tool. God has imposed upon our imagination a fact of life, that every creature is more complex than meets the eye. He did this so the promise of resurrection would make sense to us the moment we heard it. Another reason the resurrection should never seem incredible to anyone is the concept of justice. All of us understand the principle of justice, and we all acknowledge it as right and desirable. This is because morality, that is, the distinction between right and wrong, actually does exist. It is one of our rational senses, among others, such as empathy and humor. God gave us the inherent ability to judge between right and wrong, and we all judge all the time. But right and wrong cannot exist if a higher authority does not exist. So our sense of ethics, our ability to distinguish right and wrong, every bit as real as any of our physical senses, proves the existence of God and judgment. Justice is the expectation of judgment, the intuition that right must eventually win. We all reason this way, and since we know justice is never completely fulfilled in this life, it is eminently reasonable to assume an afterlife. There is another reason. Call it a reverse calculation, using the very existence of reason. Remember, there is a reasoner behind creation. Therefore, the ability to reason implies that there is a reason for the ability. Just like a blind man's eyes prove the existence of light, even if he has never seen light. We can only consider ourselves to be rational beings if the ability to reason makes sense. Call yourself rational and then conclude there is no reason for anything? The simple fact is, nothing makes sense if death is the end of all. Since sense must make sense, and death makes meaningless nonsense out of everything, it follows that death is not the end of rational beings. Coming to the conclusion through our ability to reason that there is no reason for us to reason, no purpose for our thoughts, no meaning behind our understanding, no logical objective to learn or discover or calculate or seek the Creator or worship Him, is unreasonable. It is much like a child in the womb coming to the conclusion that his legs are a useless and monstrous deformity, his eyes and ears nothing more than vestigial lumps on his head, which might as well be surgically removed. Imagine an argument between twins in the womb, the one who happens to be a member of the Rational Fetus Foundation, insisting to the other that his naive and credulous hope of a life outside is irrational, while the other can't get that tune out of his head. These feet were made for walking, and that's just what they'll do. The song is not proof, not even a deep thought, but it's far from irrational. I'm not saying these modern brain thumpers aren't smart in their own right. I'm just saying when it comes to understanding creation and its purpose, a quick dismissal of minds like Paul and Pascal and Pasteur and Paine, for that matter, is not the most rational reaction. The resurrection was promised in the Bible, and it has been proven both possible and true by Jesus Christ, according to eyewitnesses. Take the Bible and reconsider it, this time with humility, because it claims that Jesus rose again from the dead, and that is good news for you. And all things considered, it not only makes perfect sense, it actually makes sense out of everything.